Everyone, Dr. Hall here. Lecture 15 is going to be about fetal development and congenital malformations. But before we get into that, I want to reinforce some of the concepts we learned in Lecture 14 on fertilization, implantation, and embryogenesis by reviewing them quickly and then talking about some anomalies, so some examples of when things go wrong in those processes. So let's remind ourselves fertilization. So one sperm is going to be able to penetrate through that corona radiata, those cells surrounding the oocyte, and it's going to use its acrosomal cap, the enzymes in the head of the sperm in the acrosome, to then burrow through the zona pellucida and enter the oocyte, and then the nucleus from the sperm, which has 23 chromosomes, will fuse with the nucleus from the oocyte, which has 23 chromosomes, and we're going to have a brand new combination of genetic material that's never existed before. That new cell with 46 chromosomes is the zygote. After fertilization, that zygote is going to undergo that process of cleavage, of rapid cell replication via mitosis, making exact copies of itself. It'll go from 1 cell to 2 to 4 to 8 and so on. It will become a ball of cells called a morula, and then eventually a hollow ball of cells called a blastocyst. And recall that the outer layer of cells of the blastocyst are the trophoblast that will eventually go on to become the placenta. And then we have the inner cell mass here, which is what will go on to become the embryo. And this is an exciting time when you form the blastocyst because it's the first time we have differentiation where cells kind of diverge in their future paths. So here's the blastocyst arriving in the uterine cavity around day 8 or so, and the trophoblast is now going to release some enzymes so it can digest through and burrow into the endometrium. It's actually going to completely burrow down into the endometrium, and when it does, it's going to start making HCG, that hormone, human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, that will tell the corpus luteum to keep making progesterone and therefore maintain the endometrial lining. It will also tell the immune system to leave the blastocyst alone, and it will also turn pregnancy tests positive, right? So you can't have a positive pregnancy test until implantation has occurred, the trophoblast has started making HCG. That's usually about 10 to 14 days after fertilization, sometimes takes a little bit longer. So here's a text summary. If you want to pause the video and take a look at that, make sure you have the details that you need. From there, we begin the process of embryogenesis. So we're going to form that flat disc over here that has 3 layers: the outer ectoderm, which will go on to become the skin and the nervous system, the middle mesoderm, which will go on to become muscles and bone and blood vessels, and then the inner endoderm, which will become the inside linings of our squishy bits, right? Our viscera, our internal organs. And so then that disc is going to fold around itself into a tube, and then that tube kind of curves like this, and all the rough outlines of the major organs of the body start to be built, right? They're not finished yet, they're not fully functional yet, but we've started making all of the major organs during embryogenesis. So by the time we get to 8 weeks after fertilization or 10 weeks pregnant, all of the essential body parts have been started. The tail is mostly resorbed, and the embryo is about 3.5 to 4 centimeters, or approximately 1.5 inches in size. So still very tiny. And just to give you an example of how tiny we're talking, here I've juxtaposed a picture of a human embryo that was about 8 to 9 weeks with a quarter, and so I kind of sized them so that they're in relative sizes. So you can see that at 10 weeks pregnant, which is really 8 weeks after fertilization, The embryo is about the size of a quarter. If you kind of curled it up, it would be about the size of a quarter. So let's talk about some anomalies or some abnormalities. What happens if this process doesn't work correctly? And so there are two potential things that can go wrong at this stage. One is spontaneous abortion. We'll talk about what that is. And the other is ectopic pregnancy. So first, let's talk about spontaneous abortion. When you hear the word abortion, most people think of a purposeful or intentional ending of a pregnancy. However, in medical terminology, an abortion just means an end of something, regardless of the cause of the end. So the lay term is miscarriage, but the technical term is spontaneous, meaning nobody did anything on purpose to make it happen. It just happened. Spontaneous abortion. So this is loss of a pregnancy, it's a miscarriage, it's very common. So again, spontaneous abortion is a pregnancy loss or miscarriage. And this can happen, right, when you think of all the things that had to come into place, right? So once the egg gets fertilized and we have a zygote, the challenge has only just begun. You have to do cleavage, then you have to properly form into a blastocyst, then you have to properly implant and burrow into the endometrium, then you have to make enough HCG, the corpus luteum has to continue to make progesterone, and you have to have all the normal genetic material that you need to construct a future human being, right? So you need to have lots of things falling into place to form all of those organs. So if something goes wrong, then the pregnancy won't be established or it won't continue, right? So if something major goes wrong, then you're going to lose that pregnancy because it's no longer viable. And so abortion, as I said, just means the end of a pregnancy. Spontaneous means it happened on its own. So a spontaneous abortion is a miscarriage. They're the same thing. What you think of in lay terms as abortion is technically termed induced abortion, right? Which is the purposeful ending of a pregnancy. So let's take a look at the numbers first of all. So fertilization, if we have 100 zygotes that are successfully fertilized, statistically 25% of those won't make it through implantation. In almost all of these cases, it's because there are genetic abnormalities. The chromosomes are just not correct, right? They just didn't have all the genes that they needed in the right combinations to make a future human being. So 25% of fertilized eggs won't even make it to implantation, won't even survive that first 7 to 10 days. 75% of them will implant, right? And then they're going to go about setting into the process of embryogenesis. And of those, about 20 won't survive that whole process. In about half of those, it's because of genetic abnormalities, right? They just didn't have the right chromosomal combinations because of some error in meiosis, most likely. Or in the other half, it's because the mother became very ill or was injured, there was something going on with the uterus, or she was exposed to some type of a toxin which damaged the developing embryo, and we call those teratogens. So you can see that out of 100 zygotes, a total of 45 of them didn't survive past embryogenesis, right? So we only have 55 that survive beyond those first 10 to 14 weeks, which we would think of as the first trimester. So this is a difficult thing that zygotes have to do, and so, almost half the time they don't quite make it. What I want to point out to you here is that of the 45% that don't make it through embryogenesis, the vast majority of those, it's due to a genetic abnormality. In some others, it's due to an illness or an injury or something that there may have been some actions by the mother, but maybe not, right? They could have been things beyond her control. So I think it's really important to take a moment to realize that when a miscarriage, a spontaneous abortion occurs, it's almost always due to a genetic abnormality. The genes that were there were not compatible with life. You didn't have enough instructions to make a future human being, and that is not the mother's fault, and there's nothing that she could have done differently to prevent the loss of that pregnancy. This is the same information in text form, and I just want to point out to you that those first 26% or so were lost before implantation. So remember, that is before she is late for her period. And it is likely before a pregnancy test was even positive, or it may have just been positive, right? So oftentimes these are called subclinical or chemical pregnancies, right? So using really highly accurate blood tests and ultrasounds, we can detect these things, but generally the woman never even knows. She might be a day or two late for her period, or her period might seem a little bit different than normally, but oftentimes those go unrecognized. So the other ones where the problem was failure to complete embryogenesis, right, which was about 20 to 24% of all fertilized zygotes. That's only about 10 to 20% of recognized pregnancies, right, where the person realized, oh, wow, I'm pregnant, and then they had a miscarriage. So, about half of miscarriages aren't even recognized as miscarriages. So in summary, spontaneous abortion or miscarriage is really common. Oftentimes you don't know it's even happened. It's about 50% of all fertilized eggs, but only about half of those are recognized pregnancies. And most are due to a genetic defect that's incompatible with life, which means that it's not in any way due to something that the woman did or didn't do, right? It's not because she didn't take her prenatal vitamins. It's not because she went skiing. It's just was going to happen no matter what. So now let's talk about the other anomaly, which is ectopic pregnancy. So ectopic pregnancies are pregnancies where implantation happens in the wrong place. So implantation, as you know, is supposed to happen in the uterine cavity. And if it's going to happen somewhere else, that's going to create some problems, as we can kind of see out here. So the word ectopic just means out of place. You're in the wrong place. You're not in the endometrium like you're supposed to be, right? The blastocyst is implanting somewhere else, oftentimes because the fimbriae weren't doing their job and pulling the oocyte into the fallopian tube, or once in the fallopian tube, the cilia weren't working well enough to do their whoosh, 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 to waft the oocyte at the fertilized zygote down toward the endometrium. So the fallopian tubes end up being the most common location for an ectopic pregnancy. They can occasionally, if the problem was with the fimbriae and getting the oocyte into the fallopian tube in the first place, they can occasionally occur out in the pelvis or the abdomen. So, for example, the oocyte gets released from the ovary over here, and if there isn't enough suction to pull it into the fallopian tube, then you could get an ectopic pregnancy somewhere out in the pelvis. So these are a problem because only the uterus is built to nourish a growing embryo and fetus. Only the uterus can have enough blood supply to contribute to the placenta to meet the needs of the developing embryo. Excuse me, I just sneezed, and fetus. Also, only the uterus is able to stretch to the size of a watermelon, right? So by the end of the full-term pregnancy, the uterus is it went from the size of a fist to the size of a watermelon. Fallopian tubes are not designed to do that. They cannot do that. And so ectopic pregnancies are not only insufficient to support the fetus because you can't get enough blood supply, but they're also highly dangerous to the pregnant person because those fallopian tubes, as the embryo and fetus grows, they will rupture and break open because they just can't stretch enough. And this is a life-threatening emergency because the placenta has all these big blood vessels in it, and the person can very quickly bleed to death if they're not taken to the operating room immediately. This is a big deal. So, a ruptured, by which we mean the tube has ruptured or broken open, ectopic pregnancy is a medical emergency for the woman. If we know somebody has an ectopic pregnancy, that is a major problem. It needs treatment. Unfortunately, the fetus cannot be saved. So, you saw how when the blastocyst implants, it burrows down into the lining and sends these little finger-like projections, those villi, out into the endometrium or whatever tissue it's implanting in. So it's really embedded in there. And so there's just no way to scoop it out and then have it reimplant somewhere else. So unfortunately, and much to many people's grief, right? Oftentimes these are desired, wanted, beloved pregnancies. The pregnancy cannot be saved. The fetus cannot be saved. We just don't have the technical ability to do that. Here's a picture of ruptured ectopic. So over here we have the uterus. Oops, where's my... Oop. Oh, darn. Sorry about that. Here's another one. So here's the uterus. This one is growing out in the pelvis. The other one was in the fallopian tube. And sorry, it doesn't let me go back. And we can see, right, here's a fallopian tube over here. There's probably an ovary somewhere underneath here, but there's all this blood here, right? These bleed. This is obviously a picture taken at surgery. This is life-saving surgery for the mother. This embryo cannot be reimplanted somewhere else, right? We just can't keep that placenta intact and get it somewhere else. So ectopic pregnancy is a pregnancy in the wrong place, not in the uterus. Most commonly it's in the fallopian tubes, and that's a problem because only the uterus can support the pregnancy with its blood supply and being able to stretch big enough. And if it's in the fallopian tubes or elsewhere in the pelvis, this can be a life-threatening emergency for the mom. Unfortunately, the fetus cannot simply be removed and reimplanted. We do not have the technical ability to do that. So we've talked about two anomalies of the fertilization through embryogenesis process.